of the colonial state in British India, 1763 to 1840. Um, there's a This is the second slide, and this is the third one. Uh, but if you go back to the first one, you'll see that what I've done is I've given a list of some of the major works that were published during this time, beginning with Robert Orme in 1763, his first volume of the History of Military Transactions of the British Nation in Hindustan, and up till 1784. And this is by no means a comprehensive list. So what you will see, I want you to just take a quick look at it. What you will see when you look at this slide is that there are works of history, there are works of cartography. I've given some of the highlights there. 1767, James Rennell, appointed Surveyor General of the East India Company territories in Bengal. Robert Orme, appointed historiographer to the East India Company in 1769. Incidentally, there was no royal historiographer in England. So it's very interesting that in India, the company actually appointed a historiographer. That was his official position, although there was no such position in Britain itself, right? And then of course, some of the figures that a few of you at least will be familiar with. Those of you who have actually studied Indian history at the master's level, for example, people like William Jones, you can see that in 1771. And then if you go further down the list here, you get into people like Charles Wilkins, his translation of the Bhagavad Gita with the preface by Warren Hastings, John Gilchrist, an enormously interesting figure who did a dictionary English and Hindustani, and so forth and so on. I'm not going to read it out to you. This is what I want to start with. I want to ask you a question. And the way we're going to run this course really is that this is not intended to be a lecture, so I'm going to talk and we're going to have a discussion. So what I want to ask you is this. Why were the British, you think, so interested in producing a body of knowledge about India? Right? And there may be some very evident answers, some obvious answers, but there might be some that might not be so obvious. But you can begin with the most obvious. Right? So the question is that in these years, in these three slides, I've given you a list of 50 works on cartography, geography, history, surveying, dictionaries of Indian languages, grammars of Indian languages. Right? So the question is, why do you think the British were so interested in producing this body of knowledge about India?
So,
yes.
So first thing, I think that first of all, as the Britishers are outsiders, first of all, they want to know India because they are going to rule India.
Yes.
And after knowing India, because they have to develop a mechanism by which they can show that they are superior, and because of this thing, they are allowed to rule India and Indians are inferior.
Okay. So the body of knowledge, you have actually given a number of different propositions. The first proposition you started out with was that the British wanted to know India. Why do they want to know India? They want to know India because if you're going to rule a people, after all, you should know something about them.
Yes.
Although, by the way, that is not a self-evident proposition, if you ask me.
Yes.
Right? I mean, in most empires in the ancient days, they didn't necessarily produce a knowledge about the people that they governed. So let's take a very contemporary example. The contemporary example would be that there is a working class in every country, no matter how advanced a country it is. It's not clear, it's not self-evident in any case, that the ruling elites always really want to know much about the working class. In fact, very often they want to know nothing about them. They want to keep them at a distance. So it's not necessarily, I agree with you, but I'm just saying it's not a self-evident proposition, although we assume it is, that to rule a people, you have to know them. It depends, of course, on the nature of the rule. So actually, you are right about here in this case, and the reason you're right is because, of course, the British did not represent themselves as despotic, right? If you were despotic, then you might say, well, I don't really care what my subjects think about me. But they did not represent themselves as despotic. In fact, to the contrary, they represented themselves as people who were bringing the rule of law to India. Right? So you're right about that. But I'm just saying it's not necessarily the case, right, that rulers want to know the people that they govern. We assume that to be the case, but it's not clear to my mind. And then you said, and that's the third proposition that you mentioned then, and that one is even less clear to me as being a self-evident proposition, that this would therefore show that they were superior and the Indians were inferior, right? How does a work of surveying show that?
Actually, sir, the thing is, in case of survey, it is not it's possible. The books written on Indian geography, geography, and the books there means the Britishers translated the ancient texts.
Yes.
These books doesn't reflect these things. But the thing is, because we all know that this white man's burden, the British used to propagate.
Yes.
In the whole part where they colonized.
Yeah.
The place wherever the British colonized, the parts of world where the British colonized, this so-called spreaded this thing, this white man's burden.
Yes.
So sir, this thing is that to me, it's because this is histories and what we are discussing, these are very subjective. These are not objective.
Yes.
So to me, white man's burden is nothing but because they are whites and they are considering that because it is their burden to enlighten the Indians.
Yes.
So to me, this to me, after certain action, this is that they are considering themselves superiors, and as Indians they are considering inferior, and that's why they are considering the Enlightenment. They are enlightening us, and that's why they are considering it as a burden and all this.
Okay. So what I want to suggest is this. There are a great many other reasons why they're doing it. We'll get to them, but let's stick with this point here. I want to see if we can use a different language to describe the phenomenon that you're talking about, because I think that language is more productive. And for the first session, some of the readings that you had, we obviously cannot delve into the readings in detail, right? But the readings you had, the theoretical readings were Foucault, Said, and Intet, right? These were the theoretical readings that we had for this particular session. Now, would you say that Edward Said, now, because one of the things that I'm going to urge you to do, request you to do, is that for each session, you think of the readings and think in relation to those readings when we have a discussion. Because if you have been given Said's Orientalism, just the first part of it, there's a reason why you've been given that set of readings. What would be the terms that Edward Said would use? Because what you're talking about is very broadly, in some very general sense of the term, it's a subject matter that he's dealing with, correct? But I don't think he uses terms such as superior or inferior. Nor does he use, for example, a term that you didn't use, but many students would. If I press them further, they would almost certainly do it. So if the question is, what is Edward Said's Orientalism about? Very often an American undergraduate will say, it's about how some people have prejudices about others. Is that really what Edward Said's Orientalism is about? No. Because if you could produce a human being in front of me who didn't have prejudices about some other people, I would be very surprised, personally. No matter how much one might represent oneself as being completely free of something called prejudices, I think I have yet to meet a person who is completely free of prejudices. And it's not even clear why we should be free of prejudices either. All right? I will go so far as to say this. I'm not saying that prejudices are something that we should cultivate, but there may be situations in which they are actually healthy. They may be. And we also have to understand that prejudices are not equal. A black person in America having prejudices about white people is very different with respect to its political implications than a white person having prejudices about a black person and vice versa. And same thing about a Brahmin and a Dalit having prejudices about each other. They're not equivalent by any stretch of the imagination, right? So now the question is that you said superior, inferior. So we'll come back to this. We'll come back to the question, but let's open up a side question. That is, what is the argument of Said's Orientalism? there's several arguments there, and anyone, everyone is obviously invited to come into the discussion. What is the argument of Said's Orientalism? Yes.
He's trying to look at a whole host of literature that was written amongst European Orientalists,
Yeah.
Which is trying to make sense or trying to explain in various ways, describe and explain the Orient, which is the other in some sense, as opposed to the West. And so he's trying to show the sort of stereotypes, the sort of representations that are coming up through this literature of this region and problematizing them.
Okay, I accept what you're saying, but let's reflect on something. Instead of using the word prejudices, you used another word that would be used frequently, stereotypes. Okay, right? But does that really tell us what the nature of the argument is? Let me give you a simple illustration here, right? So if you say that Orientalism is about stereotypes, now if you read Herodotus, writing in the 6th century BCE, the book is full of what you might call stereotypes about the Persians. Herodotus was a Greek. The Greeks had all kinds of ideas about the Persians, right? However, Edward Said is very clear that Orientalism is an 18th century project, is it not? He doesn't talk about pre-18th century examples at all. In fact, the argument is that there is an intricate relationship between Orientalism and imperialism, right? Because if I had to put it in my language, Orientalism is doing the intellectual work of conquest. There's a military work of conquest, right, with the generals and the armies do and all of that. But Orientalism, if you had to put it in a somewhat colloquial terms, is doing the intellectual work, right? So it's an intellectual apparatus, but if it was only about stereotypes, then the problem is why are we beginning in the 18th century? Because if you read Dante, for example, Dante's Inferno, so he's got all these circles of hell, right? And I think you know where he put the Muslims in those circles of hell, way down, right? I mean, he obviously had what you would call prejudices. So then, if he did, and Herodotus did, and we could pick another 500 examples of that very easily, then clearly the question would be, what makes Orientalism an 18th century project? Right? If it was only about stereotypes. It's not about stereotypes. So then we say that there's a particular relationship between that intellectual apparatus and imperialism, right? That would be that there is a particular relationship, but now let's bring in Foucault. How would one describe that relationship? Because what I want to suggest to you is that when you read Said without Foucault in the backdrop, and when you read him with Foucault, there are two different ways to read Said, right? So how would one bring in Foucault here? And then we'll return to the question I started out with over here.
Is by also producing literature of a place and a people, you're also in some sense conquering them in terms of how the knowledge of a place is going to produce a certain form of power in trying to, in the representation and in saying that you possess knowledge of the people. Right? And there is also an underlying civilizing mission that became a part of the colonial projects. And I think that is, again, shown in Said's work of the way in which the contrast between the two was also became a sort of explanation for why the European intervention in these lands should be there. And what is the form of intervention that would come through. And so there's a power hierarchy that was seemed obvious in the way in which it was presented.
Right, but what you're saying is entirely acceptable, right? But it's not clear how Foucault really enters into that particular narrative that you've given, because the question here would be that Foucault deploys a certain kind of language, right? He deploys a certain kind of language. I don't know how many of you here are familiar with Ejaz Ahmed's critique of Said's Orientalism, so which was first published in EPW and then came out in a book called In Theory. Now, one of the things that Ejazana pointed out was precisely what I had mentioned to you, namely that, look, if Orientalism is really about prejudices and stereotypes and so forth and so on, then the problem is, what is its specificity in the 18th century, right? That's the other way of posing the question. What is its specificity in the 18th century moving onwards? And so would anybody like to come in here and say how the reading of Foucault would help us understand what its specificity is in the 18th century? What is Foucault's language? In the Archaeology of Knowledge, right, which you had selections from, when he talks about, let's say, a discursive formation, or when he uses the word episteme, how does that come into play when we're reading Said's thesis about Orientalism?
They're talking about the same things actually, in some ways. Because Foucault is talking about power and discourse. Now, discourse is normally related to power, right? And the episteme that is being talked about is supposedly the dominant system in a particular epoch. And that, I think, it recirculates the other kind of epistemological formations that might be there. I think. Yeah. So,
but when you say we're talking about the same thing, look, I mean, the thing is that, it's like saying to me that when you listen to the music of Bach, that it's the same piece over and over 5,000 times. It's not. Each iteration of it is actually different, right? So let me translate the question into a different way. You've all heard, even if you have not been students of Indian history, I'm absolutely certain you've all heard of something called the Black Hole of Calcutta. Okay, right? Now, how did the Black Hole of Calcutta begin? Right. So there's one person, right? His name is Holwell. Partho Chatterjee, but he doesn't really dwell on this particular point that I want to make. Okay, which I think helps. I'm putting it in an analytical framework so that you can see what it means to read Foucault with Said and why Orientalism has a certain specificity in the 18th century, because this goes to the 18th century. And we need to go back to this question because that's what the whole course is about, right? It's about the epistemological conquest, right? Let me just finish this illustration, right? So the Black Hole of Calcutta, what is it? Holwell, supposedly an eyewitness. I say supposedly because we have to see, not because I believe, by the way, that we can with absolute certainty say what happened. And my objection here is not that we don't have a sufficiently objective account. That's not my objection at all. Right? But I say supposedly because we'll have to see how this narrative lives on. Right? So Holwell, let's call Holwell A. Right? We just named this individual A. Holwell supposedly produces an eyewitness account. Now, a year later, another bloke, English bloke, comes along. We'll call him B. And B then produces an account and says A said this. Then 6 months later, C comes along and C says B and A both said this. And of course, 10 years later, you've got 100 people who have come along. But remember, it all goes back to one account. It all goes back to one account. Right? And this is one of the things that Said meant by when he said that, and he was really relying upon Foucault here, that this is the iterative aspect of discourse, iterative, repetition. And the fact that these discourses work in this particular fashion down to the present day, when I've been living in the US for a long time, I can tell you when the invasion of Iraq took place, it was all based on the premise that Iraq had something called WMD, weapons of mass destruction. And the then Secretary of State of the United States, Colin Powell, came and gave a whole presentation, which purported to show that Iraq had weapons of mass destruction. Now, you know that, of course, they didn't. And I'm talking about nuclear weapons. I'm not talking about biological and chemical. They didn't. But it was parroted by 10,000 people, and this is what Foucault meant when he talked about truth effects, that discourses have certain truth effects. Right? So in Foucauldian terms, to answer the question that I had posed, the difference between the 18th century and what Herodotus and what Dante were doing was that in the 18th century, certain of these ideas and tropes became epistemes. They acquired a certain kind of interpretive power which they had not really had before. Right? We're using a very small segment of Foucault's work but a critical portion. And then, of course, what he's going to talk about is how a certain kind of discursive formation. So what we could say, by the way, here, apropos this, is that this is an illustration of how a discursive formation comes into place. Not the mechanics of it, you're seeing the products of this discursive. A certain discursive formation, right, is going to come into place with the advent of colonialism. Right? So those are a broad set of questions. However, let me return to the question, because we're far from having answered it in all of its myriad aspects. The question for you was, why is it that the British were so interested in producing such a large body of knowledge? And the answer that had been given is of course accurate, although there are a great many things that we need to add to that. And that answer was that, well, if you're going to rule a people, if you're going to govern them, you need to be able to know them, particularly if they speak languages that you don't know. Right? A British official does something and he thinks the natives are saying thank you, and in fact they're cursing him. But if he doesn't know the language, he doesn't know what they're saying. And John Gilchrist, who we have seen over here, a dictionary, English and Hindustani, if you can access it somewhere, I think on Google they probably have it now, because it's now out of copyright. You should really look at this dictionary, and you should look at his grammar phrase book. Okay, he wrote a grammar phrase book. This was for company officials when they were coming to India. So how were they going to learn Hindustani? How were they going to learn Hindustani? They needed to learn some Hindustani. And when we look at the language section, we'll look at that a bit more closely. But I'll give you an illustration from this, which will set you thinking about this whole question of when you rule or govern a people, well, you have to know them. You have to know their languages. That's one of the reasons why, of course, in the first 50, 60 years, they produced so many dictionaries and grammars of Indian languages. So the example that he gives, John Gilchrist gives, he says, and this is, of course, you see that what kind of Indians did the British really have interaction with? Well, they had interaction with the princes and they had interaction with the servants. Those were the bulk of the Indians that they had interaction with, actually. Right? And so if it's a company official is hosting a dinner at his home and he's got 20 Indian servants, so he begins by saying, let's take the sentence, please fetch me a plate. How would you say that in Hindustani? Kripa aap ek plate laiye. Then he gives you the translation. Kripa, please ek plate laiye. Then Gilchrist says, in that same text, he says, why should we speak to servants with such politeness? Why do we need the word please? After all, they're servants, they're inferiors, right? So then he cuts it out. You see that in the text. And then he says, the translation should be ek plate laiye. However, laiye is the polite form. And he says, why do we need that polite form? Why? So then he says, ek plate lao. Right? That's the less polite form. Then he cuts that out, and then he says, look, why do we need to have a whole sentence when we're speaking to the servant? It's extraordinary. Why do we need a whole sentence? Why do we need the verb? Right? Ek plate lao, right? Why not just say plate? If you shout the word plate to the servant, after all, he'll know that he's supposed to bring a plate. Because what you want to do is you want to minimize your interaction with the servants. Now, you see, this complicates this whole sense. Do they really want to know them or not? This very illustration, but this phrase book is meant as a phrase book to be used by company officials coming to India.
Sorry to interrupt you. But sir, I will still get what you said regarding how both of these were, you said they were different in some aspects. So regarding
both meaning what?
Said and Foucault.
You see, the thing is this, that Said is not particularly committed to the larger political project that Foucault has. And that larger political project has to do with the whole notion of what you might call the human sciences. Okay? What he's only committed to is this idea that there was a certain kind of discursive formation, although if you read, by the way, Orientalism, he doesn't really use Foucault's language. He doesn't. Right? He doesn't use that language because the reason, and one of the reasons he doesn't is because when Foucault is articulating that, he's articulating it with respect to not simply the question of Orientalism, and actually Foucault, by the way, had no intrinsic interest, by the way, in the question of colonialism, I would say, if you ask me. He has no intrinsic interest in the question of colonialism at all. I mean, if you go through his whole writings, you'll scarcely find a reference to that. Whereas for Said, the question of colonialism was, in fact, actually paramount. All right. So one could elaborate upon that, but this is in part what I mean when I say that whether you read Said with the background of Foucault or against it is quite a different thing. Okay. Now, let's go back to this particular question over here. And my question was, so why were the British interested in producing such a body of knowledge about India? Let me give it to you this way. There's a large part of the world where India exercised what you might call a considerable influence. I'm not going to call it colonization because I think almost no historian would. I'm talking about what has been called for a long time the Indianization of Southeast Asia. The large parts of Southeast Asia were from the 2nd century of the Common Era until shortly before the arrival of the Portuguese under Indian influence. The kingdoms of today, the areas that you would identify with modern-day Vietnam, Cambodia, Laos, Thailand, Vietnam, the whole Malay archipelago, Java, even more than Bali. Bali is often called Hindu, but if you go to Java, the Javanese are completely steeped in the Puranic literatures. All their puppet plays are based on either the Ramayana or the Mahabharata or Puranic literature. Right. Now, what is the point of this analogy? Did Indians produce a body of knowledge about Southeast Asia? They didn't. That's a fact of the matter. Indians did not produce a body of knowledge about Southeast Asia. Right? So if you were using the same proposition that, well, they were ruling there, right, large parts of Southeast Asia. So why did they not produce a body of knowledge? We don't know anything about that at all. So I think it's worthwhile thinking about. Now, there is an argument that has been given by many Western scholars. I don't accept that argument, but I think you should know it because the only way to counteract these arguments is to know them first and to understand the underlying assumptions there. And that argument is the argument that intellectual curiosity is something that is intrinsic to the European tradition. but not to non-European traditions. This argument is so widespread, I cannot tell you. If you look at all the major ideologues, Samuel Huntington type, they all intrinsically are arguing that, sometimes explicitly. That intellectual curiosity, if you read Bernard Lewis, okay, I don't know how many of you are familiar with Bernard Lewis, so he's one of the major scholars of Islam in the Western world, now in his late 80s. He's been an advisor to both the Bushes, the first President Bush and his son, George W. Advisor to both of them. Right? And Bernard Lewis has gone on record repeatedly to say that, yes, look, even if we admit that we colonized and colonialism bad, he says there's still something that distinguishes us from them. And that is that we have an intellectual curiosity about them which they don't have about us. He's very, very clear about that, and this is an argument that is widespread. Right? Now, is that the case or not? It would be worthwhile thinking. I say I don't accept it, but I think that if you don't accept it, then you have to know how to counteract it. Okay? Because clearly, if you look at, and you could say that, well, there's always a power relationship. So 95% of the books written about women's sexuality have been written by men until quite recently. 95%. How many books were written about male sexuality by women? I want to know that. Partly it has to do with the nature of power. Those who have power produce a body of knowledge about the other. But I'm saying that even there, let's take the case of India. Right? We didn't produce a body of knowledge. So does that mean that we are intrinsically not interested? That we don't have something called intellectual curiosity? Right? And in the West, they do. And it's something that we have to seriously think about. Now, one way to counteract that, and this brings us to yet another reason why this has to be answered in a different way. That yes, it has to do with you have to know the native in order to be able to govern them, to rule them. You have to have the command of their languages. I accept all of that, and we'll be looking at much of that. But there's something else here. And I'll give you an anecdote, again drawn not from Indian history. And I want you to think about that. And then we'll draw out the implications of that. So, there is something, and this argument, by the way, has fundamental relationship to how we represent the past in India too. It's going to become increasingly important as India becomes even more enmeshed in the schemes of knowledge produced in the West. And that is the museum. There is a standard, what you might call Holocaust museum now, okay, in countries such as the United States, Britain, Germany, France. A standard Holocaust museum. What does a standard Holocaust museum mean? It means that you begin the history, basically, of what happened to the Jews you begin at the end of World War I. When Germany lost the war, there was a Treaty of Versailles. Germany had to pay reparations. That became a matter of provocation, anguish, national despair, the sense that they were being exploited. Every Holocaust museum will begin that history with the end of World War I. Okay, and then it has a standard narrative all the way until the creation of the State of Israel. And that standard narrative will then include the rise of the Nazi Party, right? Nationalism, socialism, the Reichstag fire, Hitler's ascendancy to power, anti-Semitism laws, the establishment of Dachau, the first concentration camp. There's a difference, by the way, between concentration camps and extermination camps. They're not the same. Not every concentration camp was an extermination camp. Right? Okay. Extermination camp, the use of gassing, 6 million Jews died. Okay. Standard narrative. Now, one museum I went to deviated from it at the very end. And I don't think that they understood that they were deviating from it. It was an extraordinary exhibit in this one Holocaust museum. which is in Los Angeles. And that was that when you come to the end of it, there's an exhibit which says that after the Nazis had achieved the final solution. So you know what the final solution is, right? The final solution was the phrase used to the extermination of the Jews, completely wipe out the last Jew to the extent that you could. That after they had achieved the final solution, they had one great dream they wanted to realize after that. That dream was they wanted to build the largest and most grand museum of Jewish history in Berlin. What does that mean? The largest and most grand museum of Jewish history and culture that existed would be built in Berlin, the seat of the Nazi regime, and it would be built by the regime that had wiped out every Jew. Why would they want to do that?
You could tell the history without a single person of whom you're talking about being able to actually
Counteract
or be a part of that project, right? You produce the history in a as definitive manner as you can without the counter.
Okay.
And you could also explain what has happened in the way that you choose to tell, which could.
But let me ask you the most obvious question which arises from what you're saying, which is if you wiped them out completely, there is no one left to counteract that narrative. Why even bother writing about a people who are already lost to history, so to speak, now? Why bother?
Because we have been the Germans had been invested, the Nazi party had been invested in wiping them out, right? So that itself is a project.
Yeah.
So you need to explain what your actions and all that effort has amounted to and why the obsession with that. So in a way, you're talking about yourself through them and also justifying or explaining out whatever has happened through their history.
But you see, for me, the question still remains. I see what you're driving at, but it cannot be reconciled with what I would call German efficiency and pragmatism. Spending $1 billion marks to build a museum to a people whom you have completely wiped out because they are the scum of the earth, according to that view. They're vermin. They're not human, right? Why bother? In other words, the idea is you want to remove all trace of them completely. That would be the argument, right, in some sense. So why should you even have a museum? Remembering them, because what does the museum help you do? It helps you remember who they are, what their history was. Right? I understand. Yeah.
This is also vis-a-vis other societies and countries and people, right? Like they couldn't have existed in isolation.
Yes.
So this is also with regard to their relationship with other countries and governments where you have to build a certain way in which your actions are understood. So it's not just for their own sake in terms of explaining it to themselves, but it's also, so to say, the world.
Yeah, sure. No, I accept that. That a museum of this sort is an argument, as it were, to others as well. I entirely accept that. Although here again, I think that the overwhelming question really is that you see that it's a kind of argument that would be more plausible if Germany had lost the war. See, then you have to, because here, that is, if you remember that this exhibit is on the assumption that they're going to win the war, as it were, and then once we have won the war, we've wiped out the last Jew, we're going to have this, right? If you've lost the war, you have to be able to explain. That's what Germany's been doing all this time. Atonement. We have to explain how were we driven to this kind of madness, right? How did a country, the cliched phrase, how did a country that produced a Beethoven, Bach, Kant, Mozart, Schlegel, how did they descend to this level of barbarism, right?
Even within the country, the government and the people aren't synonymous, right? So then it's also about the people of a place that I think when you take certain actions, you feel the need to come across to your people in a very benevolent way. You don't want to come across as a completely criminal venture. So it's one is to the world, one is to yourself in some sense.
But nobody would have suspected the Germans of being benevolent to the Jews if you wipe them out.
No, not benevolent in that sense. I
yeah.
think what I'm saying is most countries want to come across as being, very sensible in their actions. And so you don't want your people, even if you came victorious through the war, to think that this was, what the agenda was. You want to be able to spell it out in the way that you think makes sense.
Yeah, all right. Does anybody have any other thoughts on why the Germans would have been interested in doing that?
Could it be a more matter-of-fact reason? If you do not have the complete record of how others lived, how can you establish your own identity? How can you fashion your own selves?
Okay, all right. I want to. Okay, can you stretch that out? You're going in the direction that I want to go to. Go in, but I want to stretch
about discursing formations with the backdrop of the Enlightenment. So the whole idea of being reasonable, rational, European man standing for humanity in general. So the whole, I think the bits and pieces of the Enlightenment project dovetails with the colonial project.
So I wanted to hear the word Enlightenment here because look, we are in the thick of the Enlightenment here. Right? Now, I want to just follow some implications of this in a somewhat different language, because I think it's always useful to see if one can put it in a somewhat different language, a different kind of analytical frame. I want to suggest to you that their interest in this is exactly, in some ways, the kind of interest that we have in dinosaurs. Dinosaurs. Children are captivated by dinosaurs. Why? Lots of reasons. It has to do with, their size, they're monstrous. And yet, of course, the whole idea is to make them friendly. That's why you get all these movies which try to make them friendly in some ways too. The most popular show for kids is Barney. My teacher, Bernard Cohn, we used to call him Barney, and there was always their little rub there in very interesting ways. So, right, Barney, friendly dinosaur. But here what I'm trying to suggest is this, that the Enlightenment project is a project which conceived the world as eminently knowable in every single detail. As eminently knowable in every single detail. It would be a crime not to have eliminated the Jews, but to rather not record their history. Much in the way in which you have to record the history of dinosaurs, because Jews are part of the fossil record of humanity. There is something extraordinarily perverse about this, if you think about it. Extraordinarily perverse. There are all other kinds of implications too, that you can't deal with the people in their living form in the flesh. But their history and culture we need to know. Right? We need to know that. It's part of making the record complete. Right? This is what I think is really extraordinary about what the Nazis intended to do. Right? Of course, there are, as I said, other implications, such as how is it that the self, which you were hinting at, you were leading more in the sense of identity, because it's not clear that you have to eliminate the people in order to be able to create your whole Indian's whole argument. The first few pages is very clearly that this whole discourse about India, frankly, tells us a lot more about the Europeans. They needed this discourse in order to be able to produce an identity about themselves, but you don't have to wipe them out. You see, that's the difficulty I would have with that argument. Right? The one that you're putting forward, that identity is important there. The notion of the self and the other. How does one define the self and its parameters? Well, you have to define the other first. That is why all the Hindutva websites are obsessed with Pakistan. When they're the sites that are talking about Hindu, who is a Hindu? What's the nature of Hinduism? You just go to these websites And half the time they're talking about Pakistan. I mean, why do you need to talk about Pakistan if you're trying to define Hinduism? Who's Vishnu? Who's Shiva? What is the Vishnu Puran, right? What is Raksha Bandhan, etc., etc., etc. Any number of things. It's amazing. The amount of time that all these sites that purport to talk about Hinduism are talking about Pakistan. So that's part of it. But the argument here is a little bit different. The argument here is that the Jews are going to become part of the fossil record of humanity, number one, and that's why you need to know about them, right? Number two, that there is obviously an Enlightenment project at work here, and that Enlightenment project is this notion that the world out there can in fact be known in its minutest details, and that we have in fact a moral obligation to know it in its minutest details. Right? That's the second implication. And then the third, and that has to do with the fact that certain cultures may actually find it difficult to interact with other cultures except as historical artifacts. And so that thereby you see, because I do think there is some particular problem with the West. I do think so, personally. And that has to, and so you have to look at the history of settler colonies in particular, about what happened in Australia, what happened in what became the United States, what happened in New Zealand, less so in New Zealand for various reasons, but even there with the Maoris, right? What happened in German Southwest Africa.
Sorry, it's about the fear, desire, oscillatory movements that we witness.
Sorry?
Fear, desire, oscillatory movements that we witness, going native. The problem of losing one's own identity when one comes in close contact with the other. So you exterminate them, you fossilize them, you make them pieces and pieces so that you remain incorruptible, but at the same time, you can establish your own, fashion your own identity.
Yes, of course.
So, in India, it happened with very many Englishmen, who took up a number of Indian habits, so to speak.
Oh, yes, smoking the hookah, this and that. Dalrymple's whole book, for example, on
stopped encouraging them, British people, to indulge in these.
But we don't have time for that, unfortunately, here. But there are problems with that argument too. Okay, there are problems with that argument. For example, if you look at Dalrymple, who's written a whole book on this subject, right? There's this sense that everything was hunky-dory. Oh, things were really cool between the Indians and the British. And what messed it up in that narrative? The arrival of the white woman. Then the white woman comes, this whole relationship gets squandered. I have a problem with that. This is intrinsic to Dalrymple's narrative, if you think about it. Because Englishmen had no problem going to bed with Indian women. Indian women didn't have any problem. When the white woman comes, she puts her foot down. This is English domesticity. It will ruin everything, right? That's sort of the model. And that's the problem I have. Because again, what it does is it shifts the onus on the woman, which very typically a lot of these narratives do, you see. So that we'll have to table that aside from my standpoint for a moment, right? But the third proposition was simply only one, which that there is a fundamental incapacity that we have seen, or that can be seen in certain kinds of cultures to be able to really navigate their way with the other, except through a process of expulsion, extermination, or acute discrimination. And there are not very many people who are bold enough to say that, because it seems to say that, well, white people are all villains. That's not the point. The point is that there was some fundamental problem there, I think. But that's a very large question. But you don't have to take that end of it. You simply have to say that what we do see is a fundamental incapacity in some ways to deal with the other, except through some process of exclusion, okay? Whatever the nature of that exclusion might be. And of course, I'm well aware of the fact that if you're making that argument in India, then the Dalits might say, well, weren't there processes of exclusion in India? And I'm not saying they weren't, but then we'll have to see what the nature of those processes of exclusion was in India. What do we understand by the word caste to begin with? And not just the simple thing about, oh, it's not even an Indian word, it's a Portuguese word. We all know that. That's not the point. Even if you go to Hazari Prasad Dwivedi's dictionary, of Hindi, and you look up the word jat, my God, I mean, there are 500 definitions of the word jat, including nari jat. Jat can actually refer to gender, right? So I think that, we're not going to be looking here in detail. And obviously, when we look at Risley, we'll get to that to some extent, the question of anthropology and caste. But when I put forward this here, I was trying to gesture, as you can see now, I hope, at something much wider, right? Much wider. It's not only a question of this, that they needed to know the native in order to rule the native effectively, right? And we can extend that, because to rule the native effectively is to make the native eventually complicit, right? We can move in that direction. And there's a huge body of work on collaboration, whether colonialism is possible, without native collaboration, so forth and so on, right? That would be the logical extension of the first argument that we had if we moved in that direction. But I'm trying to suggest that we would have to wrestle with some other questions, such as questions of what is the relationship of this to the Enlightenment project? How did that Enlightenment project get translated in the colonies, right? How get it translated? Some theories are portable, some theories are not. Some phenomena are portable, some are not. So this is a question that is exceedingly important. That when we have an account, when we have a narrative, to what extent, particularly here when we're talking about an entire worldview, to what extent is it portable, right? And to what extent did this whole project get subverted in India against the will of the British themselves? That would be an interesting set of questions that we would have to ask. This was, of course, the critique of Said. The main critique of Said was the narrative gives all the power to the colonizers. It doesn't really look at what the colonized were doing. And that is why 10 years later he wrote Culture and Imperialism, where he was trying to move somewhat, to some extent, in a different direction. Right? But the question also, to reiterate for the last time, the whole question of intellectual curiosity, the intellectual apparatus of knowledge in a culture. What interest does one culture have in another culture with respect to the whole question of an intellectual project, right? Why is it that accounts are produced in certain ways? And sometimes the answers are very particular. And here I've given you wider templates, but then some of the answers that one could give would be of a very different sort, which would be equally plausible. What would be an illustration of that? Now, we're not doing a whole section on surveying and cartography, but let's take an illustration of what I mean when I say that you could give another account, okay, and that account would be of the following sort. But let me pose the question to you. Englishmen travel to India, English women as well, although there are fewer travel narratives by English women. But you do have Flora Ann Steele would be a good example, Right? You get quite a lot of travel narratives by Englishmen. So what is it that they see when they're in India? What is it that they see? You don't have to have really read one of these narratives, but what do you think they see, and why do they travel? Same question, by the way, comes up. That you have a whole tradition. You have a whole tradition of solitary English travelers. And there's a kind of a heroic epic mode in which much of this has been written. T. Lawrence, very famous example. Arabia Deserta, Charles Doughty, so forth and so on. And once again, think of it this way. When you study the history of, I'm just using this phrase for the sake of convenience, because we can look at this whole breakdown of history into ancient, medieval, and modern, and seriously question what this means. But let's just, for the time being, accept it. Okay? So if you study the history of pre-modern India, going back to the early portion of the Christian era, beginning there, and moving all the way into the time of Harsha, for example, okay, right, and Alauddin Khan, 13th century. What sources do you use other than Indian sources? Chinese travelers. Chinese travelers. Every historian of India is agreed upon that. You have to use Chinese sources. Now, when you study the history of China, in the 7th century or 5th century or 10th century, do you use Indian sources? No. You don't. We didn't produce any sources. We didn't. So this is where that question comes in. And we'd have to ask why. When I wrote a book about 15 years ago. I teach in a history department. None of the historians in India liked me for what I'd written there, frankly, except a few odd people here who were not really historians, but who were understood that I was onto something different. So the book is called The History of History, Politics and Scholarship in Modern India. It was published by Oxford in 2002. And one of the arguments that I put forward was that in India, ahistoricity is very important, and is in fact a defining characteristic of what I would call the Indian intellectual traditions. We really had no interest in producing works of history. I have not been convinced by anyone to the contrary. I have seen all kinds of arguments against it, from the most daft arguments, as I call them. Oh, the Mahabharata is a work of history. Everything's a work of history by that argument. It's like looking for a needle in a haystack. Of course, that doesn't mean that you can't you cannot make historical inferences. You can. That's a different thing. So if Draupadi is married to 5 men simultaneously, well, you could say that, well, we may be able to say something about the institution of polyandry, for example. That would be an inference. Right? But if somebody told me, yeah, this is all history, it's absolutely bogus argument. And the question would be, why would we want to treat it as a work of history? And somebody like Gandhi, I think, was, as in most things, really astute, because he was very clear that this whole argument about Krishna being a historical character, look at Bankim Chandra Chatterjee. He writes a whole book called Krishna Charitra, the biography of Krishna. How do you write a biography of Krishna? A biography, right? I mean, it's something really quite absurd, if you ask me, right? But it's when you become captive to this idea that historical consciousness is critical, and we had it, and that if we accept James Mill argument, then we're just simply being colonized, because Mill was very clear that Indians had no sense of history. I think he's absolutely right, except that I don't want to draw the inferences he draws from it. Not at all. I don't think of it as a lack. He thought it as a lack, serious lack. You see, right? So if you look at the India-China, it's very interesting that if you're studying the history of India, you have to rely upon Chinese sources for certain periods. I'm not talking about the 19th century. I'm talking about the pre-modern period, right? You have to. There's just no question about it. If you're going to look at the accounts of what was happening in the 13th century during the time of Alauddin Khilji, you've got to go to a Chinese source, or what was happening during the 7th century. But when you study the history of China, you don't have to go to Indian sources. Of course, you could say, but the Chinese are much more, much more parochial. They don't want to use Indian sources. You could go make that argument. You always have to think of the Purva Paksha. Whenever you make an argument, think of all the arguments against that someone is going to come up with. Right? That's a characteristic of Indian thought. Is when you make an argument, think of the Purva Paksha. That is the argument that you're going to get against it. That should be contained within your argument already. So you could make that, but frankly, that in this particular case where the Chinese are much more, parochial than the Indians. I mean, if you read Al-Biruni, which is really the first, by the way, sociological record we have of Indian society, if you leave aside the kind of narrative that has been given in the Arthashastra, which is important, but it's not a sociological record in the way in which Al-Biruni's India is a really sociological record with a very detailed description, for example, of religious practices, for example, right? So we needed a foreigner to do that, So all of this goes to that question of that the British produced a body of knowledge about India, which was massive. And when you move into the 19th century, start looking at the district gazetteers, for example, and the Imperial Gazetteer series, the detail with which things were recorded, right? This goes back to the Enlightenment project of the 18th century. And I'm suggesting to you that the corollary of that, but we have to be very careful about it because I don't accept that really, but that is the argument that there is a particular kind of intellectual curiosity which has characterized the West in its relationship to the rest of the world. And that continues to. And of course, then if you did the political economy of knowledge, the political economy of knowledge production, where are the universities, where are the resources, we get a fuller picture of what is happening down to the present day. Right, so those are the parameters of what we are interested in. Abhishek, what's the plan? How much longer do we go